One of my goals this year is to be more curious. If you're new to the channel, thanks for joining us here. My name is Jeremy, and in our community, we often start the new year by talking about something to do with our relationships. So in the past, we've talked about forgiveness and friendship and sexuality, and this year, we began the year by talking about curiosity. Now, if you already listened to the talk from the weekend, that's all right, stick around. We're going to expand on some of those ideas here in just a moment, but let's talk about why curiosity is important to us as human beings. See, one of the things we have to understand is that as human beings, we are essentially heuristic machines. We are, all of us, taking in far more information than we can possibly process. An example of this is our visual cortex. Our eyes see far more than our brain knows what to do with. And our brain will just discard a lot of information that does not fit our mental model. In fact, that's how a lot of optical illusions work. Information that doesn't fit your model will be discarded, and that's kind of fun. Now, it's not a bug, it's actually a feature of how our brains work. Because evolutionarily, it did not make a lot of sense to spend calories on processing horsepower when certain assumptions about the world would work 99.9% of the time. Those shortcuts were good for us. Now, the problem for us socially is that because of those same shortcuts, we often tend to prefer small, tightly knit communities with very clearly defined borders. We often jump to conclusions and stereotypes about each other so that we can very quickly put each other into camps like friend or foe. It's also why we often prefer people and conversations and communities that look like us and don't really challenge us to think in new ways. And that's a shame because as human beings, we live in a very diverse world, and I think most of us want to learn from the diverse perspectives around us. To be human is to never stop becoming. It's always to be learning and evolving and becoming something new. And one of the models to think through the different stages of our development is one that I kind of rushed through really quickly on Sunday. Here's what I said about it, and then we'll come back. We'll expand this a bit more. We are born into a world where the only thing that matters to us is our physical needs. When you are a baby, the only thing that matters is when you are cold, or when you are hungry, or when you are wet, or when you are held. It's a purely physical view of the world, and that works for a time. Unfortunately, eventually you grow, and your eyes focus, and your brain develops, and you realize that when you cry, there's a someone that responds to you. So life is a call and response with a higher power. It's a very mythical view of the world, and that works for a time. Still, you keep growing, and the mythic status of mom and dad start to seem rather mundane. I mean, you can do some things for yourself now. In fact, you want to do things for yourself. Our daughter is almost 3 right now, and one of the most common phrases we hear in our house right now is, "I can do it." Often followed by, "I did it." Honestly, she is her best cheerleader, and I love that about her. But all of a sudden, you start to want to assert control over your world, and you want to differentiate yourself from those who've come before. And whether we're talking about a teenager here or someone having their midlife crisis, this is a power and control view of the world, and that works for a time. Now later, we form rules and traditions. After that, we start to employ strategy and reason. Eventually, hopefully, we grow in empathy and care, and maybe at some point, we learn how to evaluate and how to make care-filled judgments about the world around us. But at each of these developmental stages, you are becoming a version of yourself. So those quick stages come from a model called spiral dynamics. Now, spiral dynamics is not the be-all and end-all. If you search it on YouTube, you'll find some videos that probably go in a little woo-woo direction. That's fine. You can head down that rabbit trail if you're interested. But there is a version of spiral dynamics that's rooted in a somewhat scientific or objective attempt to understand the modes of development that we go through, both as individuals, but also as societies and cultures. And I was actually first introduced to this more than a decade ago at an event with Rob Bell. You may know him. He's a writer and author, speaker. But about 12 years ago, I had the opportunity to go to the very first of what he calls these 2 days with Rob Bell events. I don't know if he's still doing them now, but he did for a while. And that first one was sort of like a pilot project to see if this would be an interesting project. And there, while I was there with 24 other people, he talked about this idea called spiral dynamics, a framework for the development that we go through, again, both as individuals, but also as society. So let's walk through the 7 stages, we'll expand them a little bit more, and then we'll talk about why I think it's been a useful tool for myself in my life. First stage, talked about this on Sunday, is a primitive physical view of the world. As an infant, the only thing that matters to you is your physical needs. Are you wet? Are you hungry? Are you cold? Well, this is also the most primitive human societies that we know of, hunter-gatherer societies. When you're hungry, you go and gather food. When you're cold, you find a cave and you light a fire. There is no planning for tomorrow or next week or next year. They're simply responding to physical stimulus. That's a stage that we all go through in life. Now, at some point, we start to realize that our response to these physical stimulus also interacts us or forces us to interact with a force that's bigger than us. So as an infant, that's your parents, these mythical figures who respond when you call. But in societies, perhaps you realize that you go and you gather food when you're hungry, but if there's no rain, there's no food to gather. So there is a power, this mythic reality to the world that exists outside of you, and this is where mythic societies develop. At some point after that, you want to begin to assert control over your world. So maybe that's a teenager who sort of breaks away from mom and dad. Maybe this is someone who's sort of stunted in their growth and they're still going through a midlife crisis and doing the same. But as societies, maybe you raise your own flocks or you plant your own crops. You begin to take some control over these forces that are bigger than you. Now, they don't go away, but you begin to assert your ego in the world, and this is important as well. At some point after that, we start to develop rules and traditions. So maybe there was a charismatic, powerful figure that led you into the promised land, but what happens when that figure dies? Well, now we're going to need some rules and some traditions to keep us moving forward. And this happens in our own lives as well. You grow up, but then you go to school and you get a job and you buy a house with a white picket fence and then you retire and then you celebrate. I mean, why do we do this? I don't know. It's just because that's the tradition that's been handed to us. And that works for a time as well. However, eventually we begin to apply some reason and some strategy to the traditions and the rules that have been handed to us. Now, sometimes we apply reason and we continue with those things because they still work. But really, at this stage of development, both as a person and as a society, what you're looking for is what actually works. Not what's been handed to you, but what strategy is going to be utilitarian in the world. And this might cause you to jettison a lot of the things you were handed by your culture, your society, your community, or by your parents, but it's also where you're going to begin to evaluate and weigh different options in your life and find the one that makes the most sense to you. Now, the problem with this stage is we often think that our judgments, our strategies are universal. And so at some point in the next stage of development is when we come into contact with someone who comes from outside our story. Maybe you travel to a different part of the world. Maybe you become friends with someone who has come from a different culture. But what you start to realize at this stage is that what seemed objective about your reasonable strategy was actually a product of a very particular experience of the world. And what seemed fixed, what seemed objective, was simply only the product of one particular set of experiences. Your objective is subjective to someone else. And so this is where we go through a lot of reinventing all over again. Right now, we're doing a lot of this, where we're realizing that some of our strategies are not universal, and that causes us to ask new questions about what we can learn from people who come from a different lived experience, a different culture, a different perspective on the world. We reevaluate and we question some of the strategies, the powers, and the systems that have been handed to us. Now, eventually, there's one final stage in this, and this is what we call an integrated or an integral worldview. Because we also begin to realize that, yes, even though what seems objective may be a product of a particular experience, there are still some perspectives, some views of the world that we don't want to go down. We gather up all of the wisdom that has been collected and earned through all of our life, and we integrate it together to make good, healthy judgments about the world. We don't accept everything just because it comes from a different perspective, but neither do we write everything off just because it comes from something that's unfamiliar. And this integral stage of development, this ability to pull together all of the lessons learned and earned through all of our life, is a really important one. It's ultimately, I think, the one that we're shooting for, we're trying to become. Now, the problem is, very rarely do we move from one stage of development to the next without some kind of crisis, or at least some kind of catalyst that forces us to reevaluate our assumptions about the world. And the trick here is that we do a couple things. We tend to look forward with fear, and we look back with disdain. I used that line on the weekend, but here's why it's important. All of us, I think, understand that the future is scary. We may have different risk tolerances in our lives. I am not a very risk-averse person. I've made some big changes in my life. I have started a career and left that career in ministry and started another one and then came back to ministry. I've moved across the country. Rachel and I, my partner, we have adopted 2 children. There's been a lot of risks that we have taken on, and we've been very comfortable with that. But even if you are a very risk-tolerant person, you know that the future is uncertain. And that provides a level of anxiety for all of us. So the future is fearful. And particularly when we are thinking about changing, the future is full of fear. Because every time you move to a new stage of development, you are letting go something that has kept you safe and within a particular community for probably a long amount of time. This is why I always have a lot of respect for anyone who tells me they are deconstructing something that has been foundational to their story so far. People who deconstruct their faith journey and realize it is no longer working for them anymore. It's harming them, or it's harming people they care about, and they are going to tear that down so they can reconstruct something new and better. That takes an incredible amount of courage, because nobody does that just because they want to be edgy. They do that because they recognize a disjunction between the community that has at some level kept them safe and a movement that they need to go through in order to continue to be true to themselves. That's a huge risk. It's a huge uncertainty. And anyone who does that in their faith, in their career, in their politic, deserves a lot of support and a lot of credit for going through that. The future is uncertain, particularly when it comes to changes within ourselves. But here's the other one that's really important. We tend to look back with disdain. And if you have ever met someone who believes the way you used to believe, or maybe who holds on to a politic that you have moved on from, you probably know this kind of pitiful scorn that you feel for that person. They are unenlightened, whereas you are learned, mature. You have grown past where they are, and you feel pity for them. Or even worse, you feel disdain for them, that they have not evolved the way that you have. Now, the problem here, of course, is that that's not a healthy way to engage in relationships. All of us are on a journey. All of us are doing our own work. And every time you encounter someone, there are going to be elements of their life where they have moved beyond where you are, and there are going to be elements of their journey where they lag behind you. If we are constantly looking at each other, judging each other with disdain, it's going to be really hard to learn from what that person has to offer you. Even if there are some areas where, yeah, okay, you have moved beyond that. That does not mean that person has nothing to offer to you anymore. So that's part of it. The other really important part is this. When you look at someone who is like what you used to be with disdain, I think that creates this sort of disjunction between who you are and who you were. And it stops us from bringing the lessons with us fully into the present. This is the other thing that I think has been really helpful about spiral dynamics as a model for me is this mantra, transcend and include. See, you will never stop being that infant who saw the world purely through your physical needs. Because it does not matter how enlightened you are, you still need to eat, and when you get hungry, you need to address that. So the lessons that you learned as an infant are brought with you. You transcend that. You can choose to fast. You can choose to learn something from denying your hunger. But at the end of the day, you are still a physical being who is going to have to respond to those physical needs at some point. You still have a mystical relationship with a world that is bigger than you. You still need to learn when to assert your dominance and your power in the world. You don't want to live that way all the time. That's a stunted evolution, a stunted growth as a human being. But there are times to say, no, this is what I need, and this is how I assert myself in the world. See, every stage along the way comes with you. And this is how I think we learn to develop a lot of grace for ourselves and who we have been. And that grace for who we have been is what allows us to be curious about what comes next. When you don't have grace for who you were 5 years ago or 10 years ago, when you look back at yourself with scorn, it's going to be very hard to look at the next step, the next thing that's in front of you, and to head into that evolution with eagerness. You're always going to be carrying around this guilt, this embarrassment of who you were, which is going to want to help you dig in your heels and stay put right now. Instead, transcending and including, realizing that we are always moving through new stages of development and growth, we're always journeying, and those lessons are coming with us even when we move on from them. I mentioned this on Sunday, but I've reinvented myself. I've reinvented my theology multiple times within my career. And it's easy for me to wish I didn't say the things that I said. Or I can look at those moments and I can say, oh, they taught me something. They have shaped me into who I am now, and they will, if I let them, give me the fuel to be curious about what comes next. So this is what I want to begin the year with. Hopefully, at some level, you're continuing this journey with us of trying to be more curious and trusting that this is actually part of what it means to follow the way of Jesus. Sunday, I talked all about this, how Jesus continues to grow in wisdom and stature, not just from an infant to a boy to a man, but all through his ministry. And if you're interested in that, you can check out the sermon from Sunday. We'll put a link down below. The key now is think about your stages of development. Think about your curiosity and the way that you can be grace-filled for yourself. And that can give you the fuel to keep moving forward tomorrow.